The moon hung high over the city, casting pale light over the neglected streets of a run-down neighborhood. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the smell of abandoned homes and forgotten lives. The occasional flicker of a street lamp was the only sign of life dimly illuminating the cracked pavement. Sergeant Rebecca Larson's police cruiser cruised through the empty streets, her eyes scanning the shadows. Her presence in this part of town was no accident. She had spent years patrolling these neighborhoods, familiar with their flaws, their failures, and the people who lived here, people she felt no connection to. To her, they were just the underclass, the ones who couldn't keep their lives together, who didn't deserve her sympathy or understanding. Rebecca was a woman of conviction, but those convictions were rooted in a rigid worldview that left no room for compassion. She had always believed that law and order were above all, and she had built her career on that belief, enforcing it with a heavy hand. Her bias ran deep, often spilling over into her actions. She viewed the residents of this neighborhood with disdain, convinced they were criminals at heart, unworthy of the respect she gave to those more fortunate. Tonight, as she drove through the desolate streets, her focus was sharpened, her mind alert to any potential threat. The darkness seemed to breed suspicion in her, suspicion of anyone who didn't belong, anyone who didn't fit into her neatly constructed world. And then there she was, a lone black woman standing under the faint glow of a flickering street light, her face partially obscured by the shadows. Rebecca's gaze hardened as she slowed the car, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. The woman's presence felt wrong, an intrusion on her patrol route. Without a second thought, Rebecca parked the cruiser at the curb and stepped out, her boots clicking against the pavement as she approached the woman. Her suspicion flared, the prejudices she had carried for years pushing her forward. This was her chance to reaffirm her authority, to remind herself of the power she wielded. This woman, whoever she was, wouldn't get away with being out here in the dark. As Rebecca approached the woman standing beneath the streetlight, her footsteps heavy with authority, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of superiority. This was her territory, and no one had the right to be out here at this hour unless they had something to hide. The woman didn't even flinch when Rebecca stopped in front of her, an unspoken challenge in the way she held her ground. The dim light painted the woman's face in shadows, but Rebecca could see enough to notice the calmness in her demeanor, a calmness that irritated her instantly. "What are you doing out here this late?" Rebecca's voice was sharp, commanding, as she looked the woman up and down with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. "You lost, or just up to no good?" The woman's eyes, dark and unwavering, met Rebecca's gaze without hesitation. "I'm just waiting," she said, her voice smooth and steady, as though she were speaking to someone she trusted. There was no fear in her tone, no tremor of guilt or submission. The lack of fear stung Rebecca, setting her on edge. In her experience, people who were in the wrong always showed fear, always cowered in the face of authority. But this woman, standing in front of her, seemed completely unshaken. "Waiting," Rebecca scoffed, her hand instinctively resting on her holster as she narrowed her eyes. "What's so important at this hour in this neighborhood that you're just waiting? You don't belong here." The woman didn't flinch at the insinuation. "I belong where I choose to be," she replied calmly. Rebecca's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was nothing warm about it. The woman's refusal to be intimidated, to cower in the face of her authority, irked her more than she cared to admit. Rebecca's grip tightened on her holster as she stepped closer, her body language becoming more aggressive, her voice taking on a more threatening edge. "You think you can just stand here unnoticed? I don't think you realize where you are," Rebecca said, her words dripping with condescension. "People like you don't get to walk these streets after dark." The woman, still unperturbed, simply said, "I'm not afraid of you." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, and she stepped even closer, her anger boiling just beneath the surface. You should be," she snapped. She reached out, shoving the woman's shoulder with just enough force to send a message. "You should be terrified of what happens when you disrespect the law in my town." The woman's body swayed slightly, but didn't back down. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering. Rebecca's hands clenched into fists as she stepped back, her patience wearing thin. She had no tolerance for people like this, people who thought they could challenge her, people who dared to defy her authority. Her heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she felt her control slipping. She had expected the woman to back off, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, she just stood there, silent and unflinching. The longer the silence stretched, the more Rebecca's irritation festered. She didn't have time for this. She didn't have time for someone like her. She had to make an example of this woman, remind her of who held the power here. With a flash of anger, Rebecca swung her fist forward, aiming for the woman's face. The punch landed hard, the impact sharp and satisfying in its violence. She expected the woman to fall, to crumble to the ground, to beg for mercy. But instead the woman's head jerked back slightly, and then she slowly straightened, wiping a small drop of blood from her lip. There was no fear in her eyes. There was no weakness. The woman simply looked at her, a calm expression on her face. Rebecca froze, her breath catching in her throat, as the realization began to dawn on her. This wasn't a normal encounter. The woman wasn't some random criminal to be subdued. She wasn't someone who would just lie down and take it. "Who the hell are you?" Rebecca spat, her voice a mixture of fury and confusion. The woman's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I'm Special Agent Naomi Brooks from the FBI," she said, reaching into her jacket pocket and pulling out her badge. She held it up, the silver glint catching the dim light. Rebecca's stomach dropped as her eyes locked on the FBI insignia. "You." Rebecca's voice faltered, and her heart began to race. "You're FBI?" Naomi Brooks nodded, her expression unreadable. "I've been investigating corruption and abuse of power within the police department. Specifically your actions, Sergeant Larson." Rebecca's pulse quickened as the weight of Naomi Brooks's words hit her like a ton of bricks. You can't be serious. You're investigating me." The disbelief in her voice was palpable. She had always seen herself as above reproach, as someone above the law, above people like Naomi Brooks. "This is crazy. I have the documentation to prove everything," Naomi Brooks said, her voice unwavering. "Your actions, the way you've treated people, the abuse you've gotten away with for years. I've seen it all, and it's over now." Rebecca's mind raced, panic beginning to bubble up from the pit of her stomach. She had always been careful, hadn't she? Hadn't she protected herself? But Naomi Brooks was here now, standing before her, and Rebecca knew there was no way out. Her career, her power, everything she had built was crumbling in that one moment. The weight of Naomi Brooks's words crashed over Rebecca like a tidal wave. She had always believed that the power she wielded as a police officer gave her immunity. Immunity from the consequences of her actions. Immunity from anyone who might dare challenge her authority. But as she stood there, face to face with Naomi Brooks, the realization struck her like a blow to the chest. She was no longer in control. "You don't know what you're talking about," Rebecca muttered, her voice shaky as her mind scrambled for an escape. Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her brow, trying to keep up the facade of composure. But it was slipping fast. "I've done nothing wrong. I've kept this city safe. I've kept people in line." Naomi Brooks remained silent, her eyes cold and unwavering. There was no sympathy, no understanding in her gaze. She had heard it all before, the excuses, the justifications. She wasn't interested in hearing more. "You think you've been above the law, don't you?" Naomi Brooks finally said, her voice calm but firm. "But the truth is, Rebecca, your abuses of power have been documented. We've gathered evidence of every single transgression, every person you've wronged. Your time is up." The words hit Rebecca like a sledgehammer. Her chest tightened, and a cold, unfamiliar fear crept up her spine. She had thought she was untouchable, that no one could ever hold her accountable. But now, standing there in front of Naomi Brooks, the cracks in her armor were undeniable. She tried to cling to the belief that she could still talk her way out of this, that she could convince Naomi Brooks to let her go. But deep down she knew it was over. As if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Rebecca whipped her head around, her heart racing, and saw two FBI agents approaching. Their expressions were stern, determined, and the reality of her situation became all too clear. There would be no escape. One of the agents stepped forward, his hand reaching for his cuffs. "Sergeant Rebecca Larson, you're under arrest for corruption, abuse of power, and misconduct. You have the right to remain silent." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to defend herself, but the weight of the situation left her speechless. The agents moved quickly, cuffing her hands behind her back and pulling her roughly toward the waiting police car. The sound of the handcuffs clicking into place reverberated in her ears, a chilling reminder that her once pristine career was now nothing more than a shattered dream. The world seemed to spin around her as she was shoved into the back of the car. Was now nothing more than a shattered dream. The world seemed to spin around her as she was shoved into the back of the car. The door slammed shut, and she was left alone with her thoughts. The street lights outside flickered, casting long shadows across the interior of the vehicle, but Rebecca barely noticed. Her mind was consumed with a single undeniable truth. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in, was crumbling before her eyes. As the car pulled away, Rebecca slumped against the cold metal of the seat. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the reality of what was happening, but it was impossible. The events of the past few minutes played over and over in her mind, each one like a dagger twisting deeper into her gut. She had always prided herself on her ability to maintain control, on her unwavering belief that she was right. But now, as the lights of the city passed by in a blur, she realized how wrong she had been. She thought back to the people she had hurt over the years, the suspects she had intimidated, the innocent people she had belittled, the colleagues she had manipulated into silence. She thought of the faces of those who had crossed her path, the ones who had looked at her with fear, knowing they couldn't trust her. How many had suffered because of her actions? How many had been crushed under the weight of her arrogance and sense of superiority? The tears that had been building up in her chest finally broke free, and she couldn't hold them back. She wiped her eyes angrily, but it didn't stop the flood of emotion. She had never allowed herself to feel like this before, vulnerable, exposed, defeated. She had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules. But now the rules had changed, and it was too late to undo the damage she had done. As the police car made its way toward the station, Rebecca couldn't help but think of the choices she had made that had led her here. The years of turning a blind eye to corruption, the times she had looked the other way when her colleagues crossed the line. She had justified her actions, told herself that it was just the way things were, that everyone did it. She had believed the lie that power could be wielded without consequence. But now she understood the truth, that power was never truly hers to begin with. The car finally came to a stop, and Rebecca was pulled out and led toward the booking area. Her steps felt heavy, as though the weight of her own guilt was dragging her down with every move. As she passed through the doors, she couldn't help but think of the woman she had confronted earlier. Naomi Brooks? Despite the punch, despite the physical confrontation, Naomi Brooks had stood there, calm and resolute, as if she had already known what would happen. She had known that Rebecca's time had come. It was then that Rebecca realized something that both frightened and saddened her. This was the moment that would define her life. Not the career she had built, not the promotions or the power she had enjoyed, but this moment of reckoning, this moment of realization. She had become the very thing she had always despised, someone who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. As she sat in the holding cell waiting for the inevitable, Rebecca felt a deep sense of regret. She had made her choices, and now she would have to face them. There was no turning back. The investigation into the corruption within the police department had only just begun, but Naomi Brooks knew the road ahead would be difficult. As she and her FBI team delved deeper into the web of lies that had been carefully constructed over the years, they uncovered layer after layer of evidence that pointed to something much darker than anyone had initially suspected. The department's rot ran deep, and Rebecca Larson was just one part of a much larger problem. It started with the files, documents hidden away in locked cabinets and drawers that no one outside of a select few knew existed. The FBI team spent countless hours sifting through the records, meticulously cataloging each piece of evidence. There were reports of unsolved cases, evidence tampered with, and complaints from citizens who had been silenced by the very people who were supposed to protect them. As Naomi Brooks went through each piece of evidence, the scope of the corruption began to come into focus. The abuse of power wasn't limited to Rebecca. It was systemic, a cancer that had infected the department for years. In the darkened corners of the department, Naomi Brooks and her team discovered more than just hidden files. There were secret rooms, places where officers gathered in secrecy to discuss their illicit dealings, where evidence was destroyed or manipulated to protect their interests. There were also personal accounts from officers who had turned a blind eye, or worse, participated in the misconduct. It was becoming clearer by the day. The department had become a breeding ground for corruption, and Rebecca Larson was just one of its many enforcers. But as Naomi Brooks pieced the puzzle together, one name kept surfacing: Lieutenant Victor Harlow. Rebecca's superior, a man whose reputation had always seemed untouchable, whose power seemed to stretch beyond the confines of the department. The more Naomi Brooks dug, the more she realized that Victor Harlow was not just a bystander in the corruption. He was the mastermind behind it all. Victor Harlow had been using his position to manipulate the system for years. He had orchestrated cover-ups, protected criminals, and made sure that anyone who stood in his way was removed from the picture. He controlled the department with an iron fist, ensuring that anyone who dared to speak out against him was silenced, either through threats, intimidation, or worse. Rebecca Larson had been one of his most loyal pawns, doing his bidding without question. But now, with Rebecca in custody and the investigation intensifying, it was clear that Victor Harlow's empire was crumbling. Naomi Brooks's team worked tirelessly, gathering the evidence they needed to take down Victor Harlow. They found wiretaps, recordings of secret meetings, and accounts from former officers who had witnessed Victor Harlow's ruthless actions firsthand. The pieces were falling into place, and soon they would have enough to bring him to justice. Naomi Brooks was determined to make sure that no one else would be able to escape the consequences of their actions, not while she was on the case. But just as the investigation was gaining momentum, a devastating blow came from within the department. Rebecca Larson, the woman who had been at the center of it all, was found dead in her holding cell. The news sent shockwaves through the entire team, and for a moment, Naomi Brooks felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. Rebecca had been a key player in the investigation, a link to the corruption that had been allowed to fester within the department. But now she was gone. The cause of Rebecca's death was ruled a suicide, but Naomi Brooks knew better. There was no way Rebecca, a woman who had been desperate to save herself from the consequences of her actions, would have taken her own life. The circumstances surrounding her death were suspicious, too convenient, too quick. Naomi Brooks had no doubt that Victor Harlow was behind it. He had always been a master manipulator, and now he had silenced one of the most critical witnesses to his crimes. Rebecca's death was no accident. It was a message. The news of Rebecca's death was no accident. It was a message. The news of Rebecca's death hit Naomi Brooks hard. She had never expected to form any kind of bond with the woman, but over the course of the investigation, she had come to understand the complexities of Rebecca's life. Rebecca had made mistakes, yes, but she had also been a product of a system that had allowed her to thrive in her life. Rebecca had made mistakes, yes, but she had also been a product of a system that had allowed her to thrive in her abuse of power. In a way, Naomi Brooks felt pity for her, but that pity did not erase the damage Rebecca had caused, nor did it make her death any less significant in the larger fight for justice. In the days following Rebecca's death, Naomi Brooks found herself consumed with rage and determination. Rebecca's passing was a tragedy, but it had also served to ignite a fire in Naomi Brooks that couldn't be extinguished. She wasn't about to let Victor Harlow get away with this. She couldn't. Rebecca's death only deepened her resolve to take down the man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, the one who had orchestrated everything. Naomi Brooks knew that the investigation would have to press on despite the setback. Victor Harlow was still out there, still pulling the strings, still trying to cover his tracks. The FBI team redoubled their efforts, working with even more intensity than before. They knew that Victor Harlow's time was running out, and they couldn't afford to let him slip through their fingers. The investigation revealed even more shocking details about Victor Harlow's role in the corruption. He had used his power to ensure that his criminal activities were hidden from public view, and anyone who tried to expose him had been silenced. But Naomi Brooks wasn't intimidated by him. She had seen firsthand how far he would go to protect himself, and she was ready to do whatever it took to bring him down. As Naomi Brooks stood in front of the evidence, her hands clenched into fists, a sense of determination washed over her. Rebecca's death would not be in vain. Naomi Brooks would see this through no matter the cost. Victor Harlow would face justice for everything he had done. She had lost one battle, but she was more determined than ever to win the war. Her resolve solidified as she walked out of the office, ready to take on the next chapter of the fight. The investigation was far from over, and she was prepared to follow the trail, wherever it led, straight to Victor Harlow. The final stages of the investigation had come to a head. The evidence was irrefutable. Victor Harlow's web of corruption had been unraveled piece by piece, and now it was time to confront him. Naomi Brooks knew that bringing down someone like Victor Harlow wouldn't be easy. He was a man who had built an empire of lies and deceit, a man whose influence reached far beyond the walls of the police department. But Naomi Brooks was no longer the naive investigator who had walked into the case months ago. She was resolute, determined, and more than ready to face Victor Harlow head-on. The FBI team had spent days planning the operation. They had gathered everything they needed: witness testimonies, wiretaps, incriminating documents, and now it was time to move. Naomi Brooks knew that Victor Harlow would try to fight back, that he would use every ounce of his power to escape justice. But she wasn't about to let that happen. They had him cornered, and she wasn't going to let him slip away. The plan was simple. Naomi Brooks and a team of agents would enter Victor Harlow's office during his scheduled meeting with city officials. They would confront him with the evidence, arrest him, and make sure that no one else in the department had the chance to cover for him. It was risky. Victor Harlow had a reputation for being ruthless, and no one knew what lengths he would go to in order to protect himself. But Naomi Brooks wasn't afraid. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when justice would finally be served. As they approached Victor Harlow's office building, Naomi Brooks could feel the tension in the air. The agents around her were focused, their eyes sharp as they prepared for what was about to happen. She could hear the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears, and her palms were slick with sweat. But she pushed the nerves aside. This wasn't about fear. It was about doing what was right. They were about to bring down one of the most corrupt individuals in the city's history, and she wouldn't allow anything to stop them. When they reached the door of Victor Harlow's office, Naomi Brooks nodded to the agent standing by. The door swung open, and Victor Harlow looked up from his desk, his face hardening as he saw the team enter. For a moment there was silence, an unbearable pause that seemed to stretch on forever. Victor Harlow didn't rise from his chair, his cold gaze meeting Naomi Brooks's, as if he were daring her to make a move. "Sergeant Naomi Brooks," he said, his voice smooth and mocking, "I was wondering when you'd show up." Naomi Brooks took a step forward, her voice calm but unwavering. "Lieutenant Victor Harlow, you're under arrest for corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy to cover up criminal activities within the police department. We have enough evidence to bring you down." Victor Harlow's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a smug smile. For a moment it seemed as though he wasn't even fazed by the arrest. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk, as though he had all the time in the world. "You really think you can bring me down with your little pile of evidence?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think anyone will believe you?" "We've already gathered everything we need," Naomi Brooks replied, her voice steady. "The files, the recordings, the testimonies, it's all here. Your empire of lies is crumbling, Victor Harlow." Victor Harlow stood up slowly, his face now a mask of fury. His eyes were dark with anger, and his posture was stiff with defiance. "You have no idea what you're up against, do you?" he spat. "You think you can just walk in here and arrest me? You're nothing but a pawn in a game you don't understand." Naomi Brooks remained unfazed. She had seen men like Victor Harlow before, men who believed they could intimidate their way out of anything. But she wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't afraid of anyone anymore. "You've been manipulating this system for too long, Victor Harlow," Naomi Brooks said, her voice growing more forceful. "But this is over. The people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed, they're done suffering because of you." For a moment Victor Harlow stood still, his eyes flashing with anger. He seemed to weigh his options as though trying to decide whether to fight or flee. But deep down he knew there was no escape. He had been cornered, and there was no one left to protect him. With a sudden violent movement Victor Harlow tried to shove past the agents, making a break for the door. But Naomi Brooks was quick. She stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "It's over, Victor Harlow," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "You're under arrest." Victor Harlow's face twisted with rage as he lunged toward her, but the agents quickly restrained him, handcuffing him with practiced efficiency. As they led him out of the office, Victor Harlow snarled, his eyes blazing with fury. "This isn't the end, Naomi Brooks," he spat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." But Naomi Brooks didn't flinch. She knew what she was dealing with now. He was just another criminal, just another corrupt individual, who had thought he was untouchable. And now he was going to face the consequences of his actions. As Victor Harlow was escorted out of the building, the public's reaction was swift. News crews had gathered outside, and when they saw Victor Harlow, the once powerful lieutenant, in handcuffs, the streets erupted in cheers. The people who had been victims of his cruelty for so long finally had their justice. The crowd shouted, applauded, and celebrated as they watched the man who had terrorized them for years be led away in disgrace. For Naomi Brooks, it was a bittersweet victory. She had come so far, and yet the battle wasn't truly over. But in that moment, as she watched the public's reaction, she felt a sense of closure. The corruption had been exposed, the lies had been revealed, and Victor Harlow, the man who had once seemed untouchable, was finally facing the consequences of his actions. Naomi Brooks stood tall, watching, as Victor Harlow was driven away, a small but determined smile on her face. She had won this battle, but she knew the fight for justice would continue. There would always be more battles to fight, more people to protect. But for now she allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Victor Harlow's empire was in ruins, and Naomi Brooks had brought it all crashing down. As Naomi Brooks stood in the aftermath of Victor Harlow's arrest, the weight of the case began to settle on her shoulders. The victory was hard-earned, but it felt hollow in some ways. She thought of the lives that had been ruined by Victor Harlow and Rebecca's corruption, the innocent people whose stories had been buried, the colleagues who had been forced to look the other way, and the countless victims of a system designed to protect the powerful. In the end, Victor Harlow's downfall was just one small piece of the larger picture. The damage had been done, and it could never be undone. But as she stood there watching the city begin to heal, Naomi Brooks felt a renewed sense of purpose. The case had changed her, had solidified her commitment to justice in ways she hadn't expected. She had seen firsthand the toll that corruption could take, how it could erode the very foundation of society. It was easy to become disillusioned, to lose hope in the face of so much evil. But Naomi Brooks knew that the fight wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. As she walked away from the courthouse, her mind raced with the thoughts of all the work that still needed to be done. Victor Harlow may have been taken down, but there were still others out there, still corrupt individuals who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. The fight for justice was far from over, but Naomi Brooks was determined to keep fighting to ensure that no one else would have to suffer under the weight of corruption and abuse of power. In that moment, she knew that her work wasn't just about bringing down criminals. It was about restoring faith in a system that had failed so many. It was about ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, no matter their station in life, could live in a world where justice prevailed. The story of Victor Harlow's arrest was just one chapter in a much larger struggle, and Naomi Brooks was prepared to keep writing it. She would continue to fight for what was right, no matter the cost, because justice, she realized, was worth fighting for, no matter how hard the battle. And with that resolve, Naomi Brooks stepped forward, ready for whatever challenge lay ahead. The future was uncertain, but she would face it with courage, knowing that the fight for justice never truly ends.